In these times, when the greatest threat to London's peace and prosperity is terrorism, it's easy to forget that London was once one of the most heavily defended cities in the world. In fact, by the First World War, the whole of the southeast of England was crisscrossed with a series of robust fortifications. Although London's defences have been attacked from across the Channel by the French, the Spanish, the French again, and then the Germans, they've only been twice overwhelmed, in AD 43 by the Romans and in 1066 by the Normans. The story in our aerial journey perhaps starts and ends down here on the coast at Dover Castle. The advantage of being up in the air that it's possible to see the whole layout in a single view. Dover is probably the most remarkable defensive site in England. It was in continuous use from the Iron Age until the end of the Cold War. That's more than 1,500 years of defensive history. It's difficult today to see that Dover Castle was built on the site of an Iron Age hill fort. But hill forts were being built all over the south of England, reflecting the violent and uncertain nature of Celtic society. Beacon Hill in Hampshire near Beauclair is a well-preserved example. The camp would have contained huts, and some of the faint outlines still remain. On top of the ramparts, there'd have been a wooden fence and strong gates. This meant it was also a place to bring in livestock during times of danger. And in AD 43, there was real danger from the invading Roman army. The conquering army's first priority after their initial landing was to establish a chain of supply bases, and the first and most important of these was at Richborough in Kent. Here you can also see the later masonry walls and the foundations of a great triumphal arch in the shape of a cross. The Romans founded London sometime around AD 50, and at first it was only defended by a ditch. A big mistake, as it turned out, because in AD 61, Boudicca, the queen of the Iceni, led a revolt that completely destroyed the city. There were no survivors. Londinium took a while to recover, but when it rose from the ashes, it was a fortified town surrounded by a stone wall at least 20 foot high. This section, of which the bottom half is Roman, is by Tower Hill tube station. These medieval towers, by the Barbican Centre, have been built on top of the original Roman ones. London was the largest and most important Roman town in Britain, but it wasn't the only fortified one. Canterbury, originally settled by the Romans, is on Watling Street, the Roman road from Richborough to London. It too was surrounded by tall walls, some of which survive, although much rebuilt in the Middle Ages. The Romans left some defensive forts too. Pevensey in Sussex was built by the Romans in the 3rd century as a defence against the invading Saxons. Some of its walls survived to 20 feet high. Eventually, the fort was overwhelmed by the Saxons, who slaughtered the defenders. Later, as we shall see, a Norman castle was built within its walls. In their turn, the Saxon kings faced the next invaders, the Vikings. At first, they managed to repel them, but after a famous defeat on the watery causeway at the Battle of Malden in Essex in 991, the Vikings got the upper hand. But the eventual Viking victory was short-lived, and as every schoolchild knows, in 1066 the Normans landed at Pevensey Bay in East Sussex. The Norman conquest, unlike previous waves of settlers and invaders, involved the ruthless imposition of an alien ruling class on the native population. This was largely achieved by the construction of massive stone buildings, and the most important of these were the castles. These masonry structures were quite unlike anything seen in England before, and by 1100 there were 84 across England. The first was started at Pevensey in September 1066. On his way to London, William the Conqueror received the surrender of the English leaders at Berkhamsted in Hertfordshire, where another castle was raised. But the Conqueror's goal was London, where he arrived in December, and there he built the greatest of all Norman castles within the corner of the Roman city walls. The White Tower, so called because it was once whitewashed, is the centre of the castle, but it continued to be modified and added to right up until the building of a barracks in Queen Victoria's reign. The tower was begun, but never completed, by William the Conqueror. And we've got to remember that the castle was built by him not to defend London, but to subjugate and terrify it into submission. Royal castles were built strategically around London and across England. For the most impressive military one, we must return to Dover. This was regarded as a crucial strategic location well into the 20th century. The great Norman tower, or keep, still dominates the fortress despite 1,000 years of modification. The keep at Windsor, known as the Round Tower, although refaced and heightened in the 19th century, is still essentially Norman. Windsor has been occupied by the monarchy since the Norman period, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited castles in the world. In Essex is the less well-known but spectacularly sited Hadley Castle. It was originally built for Hubert de Burgh in 1232, but was rebuilt by Edward III to guard the approach to the Essex marshes and to the Thames estuary. The reason so little survives today is because Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, sold it off and allowed its stone to be used for other building projects in 1551. But it wasn't only the Norman kings that built castles. The great barons and the Norman bishops also exerted their authority by building their own. The Archbishop of Canterbury built the tallest Norman keep in England at Rochester in 1127. It was to guard the crucial river crossing to Dover and the south coast. As well as the Norman super-rich, the lesser nobility were also busy establishing their more modest fortresses. In Amesford, in Kent, an early Norman castle built in an oval enclosure around a small hall is typical of the smaller castles of the Norman conquest. The castle was built by William de Amesford, who ruled the surrounding land in the name of the king, and would, of course, have had the power of life or death over the local population. Pleshy in Essex probably illustrates better than anywhere else the impact of the Norman invasion on England. The castle has a 50-foot-high motte, or mound, upon which the keep was built, and a lower bailey, or outer court, with ramparts rising 36 feet above the moat. It was built by Geoffrey de Mandeville in the centre of his new lands. Around the castle grew up a fortified township, almost the same size today as it was in Norman times. By the end of the 14th century, castles like Bodrum in Sussex were altered to take into account the development of artillery. Bodrum, or Bodiam in East Sussex, combined up-to-the-moment defensive features such as gun ports and powerful circular towers on each corner. But it also had sumptuous accommodation around a central courtyard. It was said that the castle in the late 14th century boasted 33 fireplaces and, amazingly, 24 lavatories built into the walls, complete with drainage, flushing into the moat. Not far away is another perfectly symmetrical moated castle, but this time built of brick. Herstmonceux in Sussex, like Bodrum, would not really have been capable of resisting artillery fire, and in fact was more of an elegant and sophisticated residence than a proper fortress. Essentially, all real fortifications, from the reign of Henry VIII onwards, belonged to the state. Equally important in Henry's reign was the rise of the Royal Navy. That meant the first line of defence was now the fleet. Henceforth, defences in and around London played a supporting role to sea power. Some forts were built to repel specific threats of invasion. Henry VIII built a spectacular line of coastal defences that stretched from Hull in Yorkshire to Milford Haven in Wales between 1539 and 1542. They were intended to defend England from seaborne attack by the Catholic powers of Europe. Deal Castle is one of the finest of these, built to guard the Kent coast and the naval anchorage of the South Downs. It was a revolutionary shape designed to maximise the effect of artillery. Its design came from Italian military engineering. Other forts, like Tilbury on the Thames estuary, started by Henry VIII but massively enlarged by Charles II's brilliant military engineer Bernard de Gaume, protected the river approach to London. At Tilbury, pure masonry walls were supplemented by earth-angle bastions designed to absorb the impact of cannonballs. As London's, and of course England's, defences primarily relied on naval power intercepting invaders before they landed, the royal dockyards and naval anchorages, like here at Chatham, needed robust protection from attack by both sea and by land. Upnor Castle was built by Queen Elizabeth to protect her new naval dockyards at Chatham. The castle was actually put to the test in 1667 when the Dutch Navy sailed up the Medway. Its guns fired until their powder was exhausted, but the Dutch sailed through and the English fleet was burnt. Charles II was humiliated. The land defences for the Chatham dockyards were strengthened in the 18th century, resulting in the string of forts known as the Chatham Lines. These were never put to the test, but Fort Amherst, with its brick and earth ramparts, survives today from this period. Some of the greatest fortresses built since the Middle Ages were constructed to repel Napoleon's French army between 1792 and 1814. The period of greatest threat was after 1803, when a magnificent series of coastal fortifications were constructed under the supervision of Lieutenant Colonel William Twiss. The most impressive of these, and certainly the largest, was, guess where? Back at Dover. The Western Heights, as it's now known, was a massive holding depot from which up to 6,000 troops could sally forth to repel the French army once it had landed. But this was only the largest set piece in a remarkable system of defences. In 1803, the Martello Tower system was developed for protecting the more isolated sections of coastline. The circular brick towers were designed to protect the marshy ground between the sea and the firm land. They would have raked the landing French troops with musket fire. Many of these towers today have been converted into charming seaside homes. The construction of barracks for the army was given a boost here at Woolwich after the Crimean War, when Florence Nightingale and others demonstrated that if a soldier's conditions could be improved, so could his moral fibre. The greatest of the Georgian barracks was begun at Woolwich in 1774 to provide accommodation for more than 3,000 officers and men of the Royal Regiment of Artillery. By the time it was finished, it had become the longest building in Britain. In the mid-1850s, there were major technological developments that rendered all previous fortifications on the south coast completely obsolete. The first of these was the development of new ironclad warships and troop carriers. But perhaps more threatening was the invention of the explosive shell. Instead of artillery firing solid lumps of metal like cannonballs, it could now fire an explosive bomb. The new shells could have reached this ferry from the castle 9,000 yards out to sea, rather than the measly 2,000 yards from a solid shot. In response to this threat, and to Prime Minister Palmerston's fear that Napoleon III of France was planning an invasion, a new series of forts and defences were constructed. Chatham was again a major focus. Circular forts were constructed in the River Medway as platforms for the new guns. Fort Hoo was built on a marshy island and was what we call casemated. These casemates were the mountings for guns and their magazines. This amazing line of defensive forts stretched right the way around the south coast to Milford Haven in Wales. The River Thames was also fortified, including Coalhouse Fort and Cliff Fort, rushed up as a response to the French threat. However, the threat never materialised, and all these forts have subsequently been known, unkindly, as Palmerston's Follies. By the late Victorian period, it was thought to be impossible to protect London with a ring of fortresses. And so a series of so-called mobilisation centres were constructed along the North Downs. These were permanent positions where artillery and troops could be stationed if invasion threatened. 13 centres were eventually built, including one here at Halstead, which is still a military base. The successor to these were the defences built after the fall of France in 1940. In order to repel the anticipated Nazi invasion, over 17,000 pillboxes, so named because of their shape, were built between 1939 and 1941. Tank traps were also built all around London, and many still exist. These concrete traps are next to Waverley Abbey in the heart of Surrey. These were amongst the last structures to be built for land defence in the country, because in the 20th century, the defence of London was concentrated on the air. Air power was first a factor in the First World War, when a new type of military installation was invented, the airfield. The Royal Flying Corps airfield at Hawking in Kent was one of the first, and is still the nearest airfield to France. A museum and abandoned buildings marks what remains of this historic site. After the war, attempts were made to detect aircraft engine noise coming across the channel as an early warning system. An experimental listening station survives here at Greatstone on the Kent coast, built between 1927 and 1930. All that remain are these extraordinary curved shapes that would have collected the sound. But it was the invention of radar that transformed England's air defences and became crucial in the defence of London. The best surviving chain of Second World War radar stations is at Swingate, east of Dover Castle. London's anti-aircraft defences were crucial in fighting the Battle of Britain. Most of these have now sadly gone, but one of the largest batteries ever built still exists at Invade in Kent. Its 5.2-inch guns were a key part of London's defence in 1940 to 1941. And finally, back at Dover again, where after the war the castle was chosen as one of the 10 nuclear strongholds in case of war with Soviet Russia. After the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, a World War II command centre in tunnels in the cliff face was refurbished as part of the Cold War defence lines. They remained in use until 1984, when the centre of operations was moved to an underground bunker near Crowborough. Today, it's in the hands of the Sussex Police. To the Norman military engineers who built these castles, the idea that London could be defended by a series of underground command centres linked to airfields would have been inconceivable. Yet, despite the vast changes in the defensive requirements of the capital city, there has been an astonishing continuity. Tilbury Fort was as important to Henry VIII as it was to Winston Churchill. Even the Tower of London featured in Churchill's plans for the end of the Second World War. Rudolf Hess was briefly imprisoned there, in the same tower where Sir Thomas More had been locked up 400 years before. But of them all, Dover Castle is the most remarkable, a place where visitors today can see every stage of the defence of England. I suspect if there were enough room for a runway, it would still be in use.